A 13-year-old black boy in a torn uniform hands his only meal to a shivering old man on the street. Nobody claps, nobody films it, nobody cares. Southwest Atlanta breathes differently at night. The sidewalks on Vine Street crack and heave like something underneath is always trying to push through, and the corner stores pull their iron gates halfway down before the sun is fully gone, the owners knowing by instinct when the light changes and the neighborhood shifts into something harder, something more guarded. The houses here are small and proud. At the same time, little brick homes with swept porches and plastic lawn chairs. Satellite dishes bolted above front doors. American flags faded from too many summers. The families who live inside them work 2 jobs, sometimes 3, and they come home tired in a way that settles into the bones and stays there. They are not poor in the way television shows poverty. They are poor the way most people are poor, quietly, persistently, without drama. Just the steady arithmetic of more going out than ever comes in. Elijah Washington walked these blocks the way he always did, head-up backpack pulling at both shoulders, his sneakers worn smooth at the heel, but still holding together. He was 13 years old and tall, for it long-limbed, in a way that made him look older from a distance and younger up close, especially when he smiled, which he did easily and often, though not tonight. Tonight he was tired. He had stayed after school to help Ms. Carter sort and grade the 6th grade math papers. Not because anyone asked him to, not because there was extra credit in it, but because Ms. Carter had a cold and her hands were moving slowly, and Elijah had noticed. He noticed things like that. His mother said it was a gift. His grandmother said it was a burden. Elijah had not yet decided which one of them was right. The takeout container was warm against his palms. Rice and beans from the Mount Calvary food pantry, 2 blocks east of the school. The kind of place that smelled like industrial cleaner and something good underneath it, where the volunteers called everybody baby and meant it. He had gotten there just before they closed, and the woman at the counter, a large woman in a green apron with her hair wrapped in a yellow cloth, had pressed the container into his hands with both of hers and said, "You make sure you eat all of that. Now you hear me." He had said yes, ma'am, and meant it. His stomach had been talking to him since noon. His mother worked the overnight shift at Grady Memorial, not as a nurse, not yet, though she was taking classes on weekends and Tuesday evenings, but as a patient care technician, checking vitals and turning patients and doing the work that needed doing at 2 in the morning, when the hallways were quiet and the overhead lights hummed. She left the apartment at 9 and came home at 7:30, and in the hours in between, it was Elijah and the refrigerator, which held a half-empty jug of orange juice, a container of leftover rice from 2 nights ago that he had already finished, and a block of cheese that was starting to look uncertain. She had left a $5 bill on the counter with a note that said, "For tomorrow, baby," and he had left it there untouched because tomorrow was tomorrow, and tonight he had the pantry food, and that was enough. He turned the corner onto Vine Street, and that was when he saw the man. He was sitting against the wall of the old laundromat, the one that had been abandoned for as long as Elijah could remember, its windows covered in plywood that someone had tagged and retagged until the original color was impossible to guess. The man sat with his back straight against the brick, a thin blanket pulled across his knees, his hands in his lap wearing gloves that had the fingers torn away. His beard was long and gray, and his coat was the kind that might have been good once, years ago before it absorbed too many seasons. He was not holding a cup. He was not holding a sign. He was simply sitting there in the 38-degree dark with a kind of stillness that was different from sleep, different from defeat. It was something closer to patience, or maybe something even older than that. Elijah stopped walking. He did not mean to stop. His feet just did it on their own, while the rest of him caught up. The wind came down the block in a long, cold sweep, and Elijah pulled his jacket tighter and looked at the man, and then at the container in his hands, and then at the man again. His stomach made a sound that was not subtle. He thought about his mother's voice, the specific register she used when she was serious. Not angry, but firm, the voice that meant, "This is not a suggestion. Baby, you have to eat. You cannot think straight on an empty stomach. You cannot help anybody if you are running on nothing yourself." She had said those words to him more than once, and she had always been right, and he knew it. He stood there on the sidewalk and he thought about his dream. It was not a small dream. Even at 13 he understood that most people would hear it and smile in a way that was kind but not serious. He wanted to build homes, not houses, not units, not affordable housing developments with names like Sunrise Terrace that nobody chose and nobody loved, but actual homes, the kind that working families could be proud of, where a kid could grow up and not feel like his address was an apology. He had been carrying that dream since he was 9 years old, and his family had moved 3 times in 1 year, and each place had been smaller and sadder than the last. And he had stood in the third apartment, looking at a water stain on the ceiling shaped like nothing in particular, and thought, this is not what it has to be. Someone built this badly on purpose. Someone could choose to build it differently. He still believed that. Most of the time, he still believed that. But standing here on Vine Street in the cold, looking at a man sitting on concrete in torn gloves while the city moved around him like he was furniture, something in Elijah's chest pulled tight and asked a question he could not quite put into words. Something about what it meant to want to build a better world for people when the world right in front of you could not manage a warm meal on a cold night. He made his decision the way he made most decisions, not with a speech, not with deliberation, just with his feet moving forward, closing the distance between himself and the old man crouching down to set the container on the ground. It's rice and beans, still warm. The old man turned his head slowly. His eyes were dark and clear, and held the particular intelligence of someone who had seen a great deal and stopped being surprised by most of it, though not apparently by this. He looked at the container, and then he looked at Elijah, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "You sure, son?" He did not ask it the way people ask things when they are hoping the answer is no. He asked it straight with a plainness that felt like respect. "Yes, sir." Elijah stood up. He adjusted the strap of his backpack. He walked the rest of the way home, up the stairs to the second floor, key in the lock, lights on refrigerator, checked out of habit more than hope. He drank 2 glasses of water. He sat at the kitchen table and did 40 minutes of algebra homework and wrote the first draft of a history essay about Reconstruction. He brushed his teeth and set his alarm for 6:15. He lay down in the dark and listened to the street outside and felt the hunger in his stomach, not sharp anymore, just present like something he had made a choice about. And he let himself feel it without complaint. And after a while, he slept. What Elijah did not see because he had not looked back was the old man still watching the place where he had disappeared long after he was gone. This is one of those black stories that starts in the dark before anyone is watching, before there is any reason to pay attention, before the world has decided whether or not the person at the center of it matters. It starts with a boy, and a meal, and a cold night, and a choice that nobody recorded. What nobody knew yet, not Elijah, not his mother, not a single person on Vine Street that evening, was who the old man sitting against that wall actually was. But that was a question for another night, and sleep when it came was its own kind of mercy. 7 days later, Elijah stood in front of a mirror in his bedroom and tried to make everything look right. The slacks were dark navy, pressed the night before, with the iron his mother kept on the shelf above the washer, the one with the broken steam function that still did the job, if you moved slowly and paid attention. His shirt was white and clean and buttoned all the way to the collar. His shoes were the black ones he wore to church, scuffed at the toe in a way that polish could only do so much about, but decent. His mother would say, "You look decent, baby," and decent meant something in their house. The jacket was the one that had belonged to his father, a charcoal blazer with slightly padded shoulders that made Elijah look like he was wearing an idea of himself he had not quite grown into yet. It was 2 sizes too big. He had known that when he put it on, and he put it on anyway, because it was the best thing in the apartment, and because wearing it felt like carrying something forward, even if he could not have explained that to anyone. Ms. Evelyn Carter had submitted his application to the King Horizon Foundation Youth Summit without telling him. He had found out on a Tuesday afternoon when she called him to her desk after class and handed him a printed confirmation letter and watched his face while he read it. He had looked up at her with an expression he could not control, and she had said simply, "You earned this." And before he could say anything else, she had turned back to her gradebook, and that had been the end of the conversation. He had walked home that afternoon 3 inches taller than usual. The summit was held annually at the Peachtree Grand Hotel in downtown Atlanta, and it drew students from magnet programs and private academies across the metro area. The kind of event that had professional photographers and catered breakfast stations and a program printed on paper, heavy enough to feel significant in your hands. Elijah had never been to anything like it. He arrived by bus, transferring once at the 5 Point station, and walked the last 4 blocks because the bus route did not go directly to the hotel's address, and he had not wanted to ask anyone for help navigating it. He found the registration table in the main lobby, a vast marble space with ceilings so high the sound traveled strangely, voices arriving a half-second after, mouths moved like everything was slightly out of sync. The students around him wore blazers that fit. They moved in groups already knowing each other, already comfortable in rooms like this, the way you are only comfortable when rooms like this have been part of your life since you were small. Elijah stood near the registration table and gave his name and received his lanyard and stepped to the side and stood quietly watching the way he had learned to do in new places, cataloging exits and faces and the unspoken rules of a room before he put himself inside it. That was when Marcus Denton found him. Marcus Denton moved through that lobby the way men move when they have decided that every room they enter is theirs. He was tall and well-dressed in a way that required money and the confidence to spend it without thinking a charcoal suit with a pocket square and shoes that had never seen a scuff, a wide smile that arrived on his face the moment he turned toward anyone so practiced and immediate that it no longer looked like a choice. He was the executive director of the King Horizon Foundation, a man whose photograph appeared in Atlanta magazine and whose name appeared on donor plaques in 3 different school lobbies across the city. He shook hands with photographers and whispered something to a cluster of administrators near the breakfast station that made them all laugh in the particular way people laugh when the person making the joke has money. Then he turned and saw Elijah. He walked over directly, and Elijah, who had been watching him for 30 seconds, already recognized in that walk something that did not feel like welcome. It felt like inspection. So Marcus said, positioning himself in a way that included the 2 donors standing nearby without technically inviting them, "Where are you coming from today, young man?" Elijah looked at him evenly. "Southwest Atlanta, sir. I go to Carver Middle School." Marcus's smile did not change shape. That was the thing about it. It never changed shape, but something behind it shifted a small recalibration, the way a camera adjusts its exposure without moving the lens. He reached out and put one hand on Elijah's shoulder, a brief, weightless pat, the kind of gesture that was technically friendly and felt like a door closing. "That is wonderful," Marcus said. His voice had gone soft in a way that was worse than loud. "We love to see the community represented here." Then he turned slightly toward the donors, still smiling, still warm, his voice carrying the precise distance required to be overheard without appearing to intend it. "These kids need the exposure," he said. "They have never seen anything like this." One of the donors made a sound that was almost a laugh, and not quite the kind of sound that fills a silence when no one wants to be the first to speak plainly. Another smiled. The private school students nearby had heard it too, and were carefully not looking at Elijah. Elijah did not move. He stood with his feet planted and his shoulders level, the jacket 2 sizes too big, hanging off him like something borrowed from a larger version of himself. And he looked at Marcus Denton's profile and felt the heat rise in his chest, and did what his mother had taught him to do when the world tried to make him feel small. He breathed through it. He held himself still. He did not give the moment any more than it had already taken. During the Q&A session that followed the morning panel, Elijah raised his hand. He had been sitting near the middle of the room, listening carefully, taking notes in the small spiral notebook he carried everywhere. And when the moderator opened the floor, he raised his hand before he had fully decided to, and heard himself ask about infrastructure funding, disparities in low-income school districts, specifically about the gap between per-pupil capital expenditure in Title I schools versus non-Title I schools in the same city, and what the Foundation's model proposed to do about it structurally rather than programmatically. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go, quiet when something unexpected and precise has been said. Marcus Denton sat on the panel with 3 other speakers. He looked at Elijah for a moment with an expression that was harder to read than the one in the lobby, something working behind his eyes that could have been recognition or could have been calculation. He said, "Well, that is a great question," and then he gave an answer about community partnerships and holistic approaches, and the power of mentorship and exposure, and when he was finished speaking, he turned immediately to a student in the 3rd row who attended Pemberton Academy and asked if anyone else had thoughts to share. Ms. Carter was in the back of the room. Elijah did not look at her, but he knew she was there. He heard the faint sound of a pen moving across paper, and he knew without turning around that her jaw was tight. After the panel, a boy in a fitted blazer approached Elijah near the coffee station. He had the easy manner of someone who had never once worried about whether he belonged somewhere. He said almost kindly the way people say things when they do not realize they are being cruel. "Don't worry about it. These events aren't really for kids like you." Anyway, Elijah picked up his backpack from the chair beside him. He walked to the registration table on his way out and said thank you to the volunteer who had checked him. In that morning, a woman with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead who looked at him with something in her face that might have been apology or might have been admiration, and he did not stay long enough to know which. Outside, the Atlanta air was cold and bright. He sat down on the hotel steps and put his hands on his knees and breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth, slowly 4 counts in and 4 counts out the way his mother had taught him. During the year, the family moved 3 times, and he had started waking up in the night with his heart running ahead of his thoughts. He sat there for 3 minutes. He watched a cab pull up, and 2 women in conference lanyards climb out laughing. He watched a pigeon navigate the edge of a planter with tremendous seriousness. He felt the cold of the marble steps through his slacks, and he felt the weight of the morning, and he let himself feel it without amplifying it, which was its own kind of discipline. Then he stood up, adjusted the strap of his backpack, and walked to the bus stop. This is a life story about what it costs to stay decent when the world keeps telling you you are not enough. And Elijah Washington was 13 years old and had already been paying that cost for longer than anyone had noticed, which is to say he had been paying it in private, which is the way most of the real bills come due. Tasha Brooks came through the front door at 11:37, and the first thing she did was stand still for a moment in the entryway. Not from hesitation, but from the particular exhaustion that requires a person to stop moving before they can start again. Her feet had been swollen since hour 6 of the shift. She could feel it in the way her shoes fit differently at the end of a night than at the beginning, a tightness across the top of the foot that she had learned to manage the way she managed most discomforts by not thinking about it directly, by keeping her attention on what needed doing next. Her uniform carried the smell of the hospital, the way fabric always does, after enough hours inside it. Antiseptic and something underneath the antiseptic that was harder to name, the smell of effort of other people's hard nights, of a building that never fully slept. She turned on the kitchen light and saw her son. Elijah was asleep at the kitchen table, with his cheek resting on his forearm and his homework spread beneath him, a math worksheet and 2 pages of handwritten notes, and his spiral notebook open to a page covered in small, careful writing. His pencil had rolled to the edge of the table and stopped there. His breathing was slow and even. He had taken off the charcoal blazer and hung it over the back of the chair before he fell asleep, which meant some part of him had been thinking clearly enough to protect it, even as the rest of him gave out, and that small detail made something move in Tasha's chest that she did not have a word for, but recognized completely. She got the spare blanket from the closet shelf and draped it across his shoulders without waking him. She stood there for a moment, looking at his face, the way it went young and unguarded in sleep. All the careful composure he carried through his waking hours dissolved just her boy, just her 13-year-old boy who had stayed up too late doing homework in a jacket that had belonged to his father. She opened the refrigerator from habit and stood looking at what was inside it, the same way she always did, running the quiet arithmetic of what was there against what was needed. She had $1 folded in her scrubs pocket, separate from the rest of her money, $1 she had been saving since Tuesday, in the formless, superstitious way that saving a single dollar feels like it might matter. She looked at the refrigerator. She took the $1 out of her pocket. She looked at it for a moment, then folded it back and put it away, closed the refrigerator quietly, and went to bed. In the morning, Elijah was up before her, which was not unusual. He had moved his homework to his backpack and washed the 2 glasses in the sink and started the coffee, and when Tasha came into the kitchen in her robe, he was standing at the counter eating a piece of toast that he had made from the last 4 slices of bread, 1 for each of them, and 2. Put aside, she noticed, though, he did not say anything about it. She asked him about the summit while she poured her coffee, and he told her about it the way she had watched him learn to tell her things over the years, carefully with selection, giving her the shape of an event without its sharpest edges. He told her about the marble floors and the breakfast station and the panel of speakers. He told her Ms. Carter had been there. He told her he had asked a question during the Q&A and that it had gone well. He said the hotel was very nice. Tasha listened to all of it. She sipped her coffee. She watched her son's face while he talked and read in it what he had not said, Not with any single expression, but in the cumulative way of someone who has been paying close attention to another person for 13 years, and knows the particular brightness that comes into his eyes when something is real against the particular evenness that comes when he is managing something. She did not push. She had learned that pushing produced performance, and what she wanted from her son was never performance. She said, "You held your head up." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She nodded once and drank her coffee, and that was enough, because some things between a mother and her child do not require more words than that, and both of them knew it. Jamal arrived at 4:15, which was approximately when Jamal always arrived loud, before the door was fully open, backpack hanging off one shoulder, sneakers untied in the specific way of a 9-year-old who has decided that tying them is optional. He was Tasha's sister's youngest boy, small and quick and abundantly energetic in the way that certain children are energetic, as if they are running a different operating system than everyone around them, processing everything faster and louder and with considerably more commentary. He announced that he had gotten 100 on his spelling test. He announced that his teacher, a Mr. Fraser, had mispronounced the word necessary, and he, Jamal, had corrected him. He announced that he was hungry. Elijah opened the cabinet and found the last pack of crackers, the kind that came in a sleeve of 4 peanut butter flavor, the ones they sold at the corner store for 69 cents. He opened the sleeve and gave Jamal 2 crackers and kept 2 for himself, and they sat at the kitchen table together while Jamal narrated a conflict that had taken place during afternoon recess involving a tetherball and a series of disputed rulings that he described with the gravity and detail of someone recounting a significant historical injustice. Elijah listened and asked the right questions and laughed in the right places. Jamal did not notice that there were only 4 crackers. Elijah had made sure there was nothing else visible on the table that would make him notice. That was the kind of thing Elijah did without thinking, without calculation, without any expectation that the doing of it would be recognized. It was just what you did when someone smaller than you was in the room. Ms. Carter called him to stay after class the following afternoon. He had known she would. He had been able to tell from the way she watched him at the summit, from the particular quality of her attention, that she was not finished with what she had seen. She did not pretend. That was one of the things Elijah respected most about Ms. Evelyn Carter, her refusal to smooth over things that should not be smoothed. She sat on the edge of her desk and looked at him directly and said what Marcus Denton did in that room was wrong, and it happens to boys like you more than it should, and I need you to hear that I know it and I am sorry you had to sit in it. Then she said, "Your question was the best one asked all day. Not the most polite one and not the easiest one, the best one." Elijah sat in the chair across from her desk and said nothing, which was not the same as having nothing to say. She reached across the desk and pushed a folder toward him. It was a standard manila folder with the King Horizon Foundation logo printed on the tab, and inside it were several pages describing the foundation's annual scholarship, their most significant award, full 4-year college funding with mentorship programming, and a $50,000 grant designated for a student-led community development project. Elijah read the first page slowly. Then he read it again. He looked up at Ms. Carter and said they would never pick someone from Carver. Ms. Carter looked back at him with the expression she wore when she had already thought through an argument and was waiting patiently for the other person to arrive at the conclusion she had reached some time ago. She said, "Let me worry about that." He carried the folder home in his backpack, and that night after Tasha had gone to sleep, he took it out to the fire escape. The Atlanta sky was doing what it did in November, low and dark, with the city's light pushing back against it from below a burnt orange smear above the rooftops, where the clouds caught the glow of a million lit windows. It was cold enough that he could see his breath. He sat with his back against the railing and opened his notebook to a clean page. He sketched the way he always sketched, loosely. At first just lines, feeling for shapes, the way a thought becomes a plan if you give it enough room. He drew a row of small homes, pitched roofs, front porches wide enough to sit on a strip of green, along the sidewalk where there could be a tree, if someone planted one, a little square of shared yard between 2 houses where children could play without being in the street. He drew the interiors and cross-section, the way he had learned to from a library book on architectural drafting. He had checked out twice and renewed twice. Small rooms made to feel larger by the placement of windows, natural light doing the work that square footage could not always afford to do. He drew the kind of spaces where a family could close the front door and feel like the world outside had agreed for the moment to leave them alone. At the top of the page, he wrote one line, pressing the pencil down, with enough intention that it would not smudge. Build places where poor families feel proud to live. He sat on the fire escape for a long time. After that, the notebook open in his lap, the cold working its way through his jacket, the city doing what cities do at night, moving and sighing and continuing its long, indifferent business all around him. And Elijah Washington sat in the middle of it with his small dream drawn on a piece of notebook paper, and held it the way you hold the things that matter, not tightly, but with both hands. 2 days after the summit, Nathaniel King walked through the glass doors of the King Horizon Foundation's headquarters on Peachtree Street for the first time in 3 months, and the woman at the front desk looked up from her computer and went very still, the way people go. Still when something happens that they were not prepared for and do not have a protocol to address. He was clean-shaven. The beard was gone, and without it, his face was sharper than most of his staff remembered, older in some ways, and more alive in others, the face of a man who had been somewhere, and come back carrying whatever that place had given him. He wore dark trousers and a simple gray coat, no tie, nothing that announced itself, but the fabric and the cut were what they were. And the staff who had worked for him long enough to know the difference between how he dressed and how he appeared, understood immediately that Nathaniel King had not lost his mind, or his money, whatever the rumors of the past 3 months had suggested. He had simply been somewhere else. His assistant, a composed woman named Denise, who had worked for him for 11 years and had long ago stopped being surprised by him, fell into step beside him in the hallway and began briefing him in a low, steady voice the way she always did, as if no time had passed at all. He listened and nodded and asked 2 precise questions and pushed open the door to his private office and sat down behind his desk and looked out the window at the city below. In 3 months on the streets of Atlanta, Nathaniel King had watched the way a city behaves when it does not know it is being watched. He had sat outside the Vine Street shelter on nights when the line stretched half a block and volunteers arrived with cameras and left. Before the serving was finished, the photographs already taken, the obligation already discharged. He had watched Marcus Denton's name appear in the Foundation's event reports as headline speaker at 3 different charity galas, while the internal budget documents, which Nathaniel still received on a secure tablet he kept in his coat, showed a 14% reduction in funding for after-school programs in Title I districts, a cut that had been approved quietly without announcement, while the galas were still being photographed. He had watched dozens of people walk past men and women, sitting on cold concrete without slowing their stride. Not from cruelty, he had decided, but from the practiced inattention of people who had learned to manage their own discomfort by reducing what they allowed themselves to see. And then, on a Tuesday night in November, at 38 degrees on the corner of Vine Street, he had watched a 13-year-old boy stop walking. He had watched the boy look at the food in his hands and look at the old man against the wall and make a calculation that most adults with full refrigerators would not have made. He had watched him set the container down and say what he said and walk away. And he had watched him not look back, and that last detail, the not looking back, had stayed with Nathaniel longer than anything else, because it meant the boy had not done it for the feeling of having done it, had not needed to see the result to complete the transaction in his own mind. He had simply done it and kept walking, and that was a different thing entirely. Nathaniel had made a single call the following morning. He had a researcher. He trusted a quiet, methodical woman named Patricia, who had worked for him privately for 7 years, and understood that her work required discretion in both directions, finding things out and keeping them contained. He gave her what he had: a description, a location, a school uniform, and told her to find the boy without making contact. Patricia's report arrived 4 days later, 11 pages thorough and plain, the way she always wrote. Nathaniel read it at his desk with the door closed. Elijah Brooks, 13 years old, Carver Middle School, Southwest Atlanta. Grade point average of 3.9. Father deceased cardiac event 4 years prior. Mother Tasha Brooks, employed as a patient care technician at Grady Memorial Hospital, averaging 62 hours per week, across regular shifts and periodic overtime. No extracurricular enrollments on record. The report noted due to program fees the family could not absorb. But 3 separate teachers had submitted written observations of the boy tutoring younger students voluntarily before school, after school, during his lunch period. A teacher named Evelyn Carter had submitted his application to the King Horizon Foundation Youth Summit without his knowledge. He had attended the summit 8 days ago. He had asked a question during the Q&A that the panelists had not adequately answered. He had been condescended to publicly by the foundation's executive director. He had left the event without incident. Nathaniel read the file. He set it down. He read it again. He sat very still for a long time after that, the way he sat when something had moved him past the point where motion felt appropriate. At 8:15 on a Thursday morning, a black Rolls-Royce Ghost pulled to the curb in front of a brick apartment building on Delmar Avenue in southwest Atlanta. It arrived without announcement and without any marking that would have identified it as belonging to anyone in particular, and it sat there at the curb with the particular quiet of an expensive engine at rest, which is a different quality of quiet than ordinary silence. It is the quiet of something that could be very loud and has chosen not to be. The block was in its morning rhythm. A man in a postal uniform was walking to his car. 2 women in scrubs were talking outside the building next door. 3 children in school backpacks had stopped on the sidewalk and were staring with the uncomplicated directness of people who have not yet learned to pretend they are not looking. A woman who had come outside to put a bag in the recycling bin stood with the bag still in her hand. Someone on the second floor of the building across the street was holding up a phone. The passenger door opened and Nathaniel King stepped out. He walked to the front door of the building and found the buzzer panel and pressed the button for apartment 4B and waited. The intercom crackled. A woman's voice guarded in the specific way of someone who has learned to be cautious about unexpected things at unexpected hours. Nathaniel spoke quietly and clearly. He gave his name. He said he was sorry to arrive unannounced and that he would understand completely if she preferred he leave, but that he had come because he needed to speak with her son and that he believed when she heard why she would understand. There was a pause. Then the door buzzed open. Tasha Brooks answered the apartment door in her nursing scrubs, with her work badge clipped to her chest, and 30 minutes left before her shift began, and she looked at the man standing in her hallway, with the careful measuring expression of a woman who has been responsible for herself and her son long enough to take nothing on face value. She did not recognize him immediately. He was simply a well-dressed older man standing in her hallway holding his hat in both hands like someone who understood that he was a guest and intended to behave like one. He introduced himself. He showed her a card and a form of identification that she examined closely, and the recognition moved across her face in stages. First confusion, then something shifting underneath it, then a kind of stillness that was not calm, but the thing that comes just before calm when the mind is working very fast. She had not finished working through what she was feeling when she became aware that Elijah was standing behind her. He had come down the short hallway from his room in his school clothes backpack over one shoulder, and he stood behind his mother and looked at the man in the doorway, and something in his face changed in a way that was different from his mother's recognition, because Tasha had recognized a name and a reputation, but Elijah had recognized a pair of eyes. "You were on Vine Street," Elijah said. It was not a question. Nathaniel looked at the boy steadily. "Yes," he said, "I was." Tasha looked at her son and then at the man in the hallway, and the full shape of what she did not yet understand was visible on her face, but she stepped back and opened the door wider because she was Tasha Brooks, and she had raised her son to extend to people the dignity he hoped the world would extend to him, and she was not going to do differently in her own home. They sat in the small living room, Elijah and his mother on the couch, Nathaniel in the armchair across from them, and Nathaniel did not make a speech. He asked questions, and he waited for the answers, and he listened to the answers the way Elijah had noticed very few adults actually listened, without preparing his next statement, while the other person was still talking. He asked Elijah what he meant when he said he wanted to build homes where poor families felt proud to live. Not what he wanted to do with his life in the broad sense, but what he meant by that specific thing, proud. What did proud look like in a building? Where did it live in the architecture? And Elijah talked. He talked about zoning ordinances and how low-income housing developments were consistently sited at the edges of cities away from transit and parks and grocery stores, as if the assumption built into the planning itself was that the people who would live there did not need access to the things that made a neighborhood livable. He talked about natural light and how it cost almost nothing extra to orient a building to catch it, but how most affordable housing was designed without that consideration, as if the comfort of the people inside was not part of the calculation. He talked about front porches and shared green space, and the way a neighborhood's physical design either invited people to know each other or made it easy to stay strangers, and how much of what people called community was actually just the result of spaces that made encounter possible. Nathaniel listened for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "I believe you mean every word of that." He reached into the interior pocket of his coat and removed a single folded document and placed it on the coffee table between them. He told them that the King Horizon Foundation had a scholarship provision that had existed since the organization's founding 22 years ago, a founder's direct nomination written into the charter as a mechanism for cases where the standard application process was not the right instrument for the right person. He told them the provision had never been used. He told them he intended to use it now. Tasha had both hands folded in her lap, and she was looking at him with an expression that was trying very hard to remain composed and mostly succeeding. Nathaniel looked at Elijah and said, "These are the kinds of true stories that change what is possible not just for one family, but for whole communities. And what I need to know from you before anything else is whether you are willing to let this one be told." Elijah looked at the document on the table. He looked at his mother's hands. He looked at the man across from him, the man from Vine Street, the man with the torn gloves and the thin blanket, and the sharp, intelligent eyes that had watched him walk away without looking back. He did not answer immediately. He sat with the question the way he sat with the hard ones, letting it settle, letting himself feel the full weight of it before he reached for a response. Outside the window, the morning was continuing its business. The bus running its route, the neighbors heading to their jobs, the city doing what it always did. Indifferent and magnificent and full of people whose stories were happening in rooms just like this one, unwitnessed, unremarked, quietly enormous. Nathaniel filed the nomination paperwork on a Friday afternoon, and by Monday morning, Marcus Denton had called an emergency board meeting. The meeting was scheduled for Wednesday, which gave Marcus 48 hours to prepare, and Marcus Denton was a man who used 48 hours, the way a surgeon uses a scalpel with precision and without visible emotion, and with a clear sense of what he intended to remove before he picked up the instrument. By Tuesday evening, he had a presentation assembled, 12 slides clean. Design the foundation's logo in the upper right corner of each page, charts showing the scholarship's historical selection, data, a legal summary prepared by outside counsel, and a section titled Procedural Integrity and Institutional Risk that was written in the careful neutral language of someone who has learned that the most effective arguments are the ones that sound like they are not arguments at all, but simply facts being made available to reasonable people. He presented it Wednesday morning in the Foundation's boardroom on the 14th floor. 9 board members seated around a table that cost more than most of the families in Southwest Atlanta made in a year the city visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, Atlanta doing its morning business 20 stories below. Marcus stood at the head of the table and walked through his slides with the ease of a man who had stood in rooms like this one his entire professional life and had learned that confidence in the absence of contradiction tends to function as evidence. His argument was straightforward. The founder's direct nomination clause was a relic of the Foundation's early years, written before the organization had developed the rigorous selection infrastructure that now protected its credibility and justified its donors' investment. Activating it now, particularly in the current media environment, where any institutional decision could be decontextualized and amplified within hours, created exposure that the Foundation's reputation could not absorb without damage. He used the word standards 4 times. He used the phrase selection integrity 3 times. He said the Foundation's reputation twice in the same sentence without appearing to notice the repetition. What Marcus did not say, and did not need to say, because every person in that room had been in enough rooms like it to understand the language. Beneath the language was that a 13-year-old boy from a public school in Southwest Atlanta whose mother worked nights at a hospital was not the image the Foundation's major donors had in mind when they wrote their checks. The donors wanted to fund aspiration that confirmed their own narrative about how aspiration worked, which was to say they wanted to fund students who were already positioned to succeed and needed only a final boost. Students who photographed well at galas, students whose success could be legibly attributed to the Foundation's intervention, rather than to the decades of grinding invisible effort that had actually produced it. Elijah Brooks was not that student, Elijah Brooks was the kind of student whose existence, if examined too closely, raised questions about why the system required a billionaire's personal intervention to notice him at all, and those were not questions that made for comfortable donor dinners. Marcus did not say any of this. He talked about standards and integrity and the long-term health of the institution, and the board listened with the attentive neutrality of people who were waiting to understand which way the wind was blowing before they committed to a direction. Outside the boardroom, Marcus was moving on other fronts with the same quiet efficiency. He had a contact at a firm that did background research for corporate clients, the kind of firm that described its work as due diligence and operated in the space between what was legal and what was decent. And he gave them Tasha Brooks's name and asked for anything that might be relevant to a character assessment. He was not expecting to find anything serious. He was expecting to find something small, a late payment, a minor citation, an old address that could be made to look unstable, anything that could be introduced into a conversation as a concern without having to be called an accusation. He also made a call to a journalist named Preston Webb, who wrote a column for an Atlanta business publication, and who had over several years of carefully managed lunches and background briefings come to understand that Marcus Denton was a reliable and well-placed source whose information was always accurate and whose motivations were never examined too carefully. Marcus did not tell Preston anything specific. He expressed concern off the record that Nathaniel King's months away from the foundation had raised questions among staff and board members about whether his judgment had been affected by the experience, and that a recent decision he had made suggested those questions might be worth exploring. He said he hoped it would not become a story. He said it in a way that communicated clearly that he believed it would become a story, and that he had made his peace with that. He scheduled a press event for the following Friday to announce the selection of the Foundation's annual Community Champion Scholarship recipient, a 16-year-old named Brandon Whitfield from Fayette County, whose family had attended the Foundation's gala for 3 consecutive years and whose father sat on the board of a company that had donated $400,000 to the foundation over the past decade. Brandon was genuinely talented, a strong student with a real record of community service, and Marcus had nothing against him. Brandon was simply also useful, and Marcus had always understood that the most effective moves were the ones that served multiple purposes at once. Nathaniel received the meeting summary from Denise on Wednesday afternoon, and read it at his desk without visible reaction. He had been watching Marcus Denton operate for a long time, long enough to have cataloged his methods and mapped his instincts, and nothing in the summary surprised him. What Marcus had done was exactly what Nathaniel would have predicted Marcus would do, which meant Nathaniel had already thought past it. He asked Denise to pull the Foundation's original legal charter from the archive, the physical document, not the scanned copy, and to have it on his desk by Thursday morning. He also asked her to connect him with the Foundation's internal auditor, a methodical man named Gerald Hines, who had held the position for 6 years, and whom Nathaniel had always trusted, precisely because Gerald had never seemed interested in telling Nathaniel what he wanted to hear. The audit request went in Thursday morning. Gerald called back at 4 in the afternoon and said in the measured tone of a man who had learned to deliver difficult information without editorializing that he thought Nathaniel should be prepared for what the numbers showed, and that it would take approximately 2 weeks to assemble a complete picture, but that the preliminary review was already indicating patterns that warranted serious attention. It took 11 days. The report was 140 pages, and Gerald had flagged every significant item, with a brief explanatory note in the margin, written in pencil, in his careful, even hand. Nathaniel read every page at his desk, over 2 evenings with the door closed, and a cup of tea that went cold beside him. $2.3 million in administrative expenditures over 4 years that, when traced to their destinations, had funded executive retreat weekends at a resort in Sea Island contracts with luxury consulting firms that had produced no documented deliverables, and a multi-year rebranding campaign whose primary visible output was a new logo and a different color on the Foundation's website. 3 of the last 5 scholarship recipients had family connections to major donors that had not been disclosed in the selection committee's documentation. A community infrastructure grant program serving Southwest Atlanta and 3 adjacent neighborhoods had been quietly defunded 18 months ago. The money redirected to the Foundation's general operating fund, with no public announcement and no communication to the community organizations that had been relying on it. Nathaniel closed the report and sat with it for a long time. He was not surprised. That was the thing he kept returning to, that none of it surprised him, which said something about how long he had allowed himself to look away from what the foundation he had built had been quietly becoming in the years when he was busy being the face of it rather than its conscience. He was not angry in the hot reactive way that anger announces itself. He was something colder and more purposeful. The feeling of a man who has identified a problem with sufficient clarity that the problem has already begun in his mind to become a set of actions. Elijah found out on a Thursday evening, in the way that most things found their way to 13-year-olds through a phone screen, passed across a cafeteria table by a classmate named Deshaun, who said, "Hey man, you need to see this with the tone of someone who is not sure whether what they are delivering is good news or bad." It was a social media post from an account Elijah did not recognize, the kind of account that had no profile picture and a username that was a random string of letters, which was its own information. The post said that the King Horizon Foundation was under internal pressure after its founder attempted to hand its most prestigious scholarship to an unvetted candidate from a struggling public school, bypassing the competitive process that had made the award meaningful. The word unvetted appeared twice. The comments had accumulated through the day and ran in both directions, some people expressing support in the broad, unspecific way of people who respond to injustice in the abstract, others, dismissive, others, precise in their cruelty in the way that anonymity permits. Near the bottom, Elijah read one comment that said, "A kid from Carver, they must be desperate." He read it. He handed the phone back to Deshaun. He opened his math textbook to the page he had been on before the interruption and looked at the problem set and picked up his pencil. Deshaun watched him for a moment. "You good?" Elijah said yeah, and meant it in the specific sense of being intact, which was not the same as being unhurt, but was for the moment sufficient. Ms. Carter heard about the leak from a parent volunteer who had seen the post circulating in a community Facebook group for Southwest Atlanta families, and she sat at her desk after the last student left her classroom on Thursday afternoon, and was very still for about 90 seconds, which was how long it took her to move from what she was feeling to what she was going to do about it. Then she picked up her phone and made 2 calls. The first was to a legal advocate named Sandra Okafor, who worked for a nonprofit civil rights organization on Auburn Avenue, and who had, in the 3 years Ms. Carter had known her, never once treated a problem as smaller than it was. The second was to a journalist named Diane Reeves, who wrote long-form pieces for a national publication, and who had grown up 4 blocks from Carver Middle School, and who Ms. Carter had known since they were both in their 20s, and neither of them had yet learned how much the world would ask them to absorb before it started listening. Ms. Carter left both messages and gathered her bag and her coat, and turned off her classroom lights and walked out to the parking lot, in the November dark, and what she felt was not despair. It was the specific focused clarity of a woman who has spent her entire career watching systems fail the children she loves, and has decided once again that she is not finished. Diane Reeves published the piece on a Tuesday morning at 6:47, and by the time most of Atlanta had poured its first cup of coffee, the story had already begun to move. The headline was precise and without drama, the way Diane always wrote headlines, because she had learned early in her career that the facts arranged correctly did not require amplification. King Horizon's CEO blocked direct scholarship nomination for first time in Foundation's history, and then a dash, and then the 4 words that made people click, not from curiosity, but from recognition. Here's why that matters. The piece ran 4,000 words, and every claim in it was sourced twice. The audit figures verified independently the charter provision quoted in full the timeline of the Southwest Atlanta grant. Defunding documented with internal Foundation emails that Sandra Okafor's team had obtained through a records request filed with the precision of people who had done this before and knew exactly which doors the law required to be opened. Diane did not use Elijah's name. She did not use his image. She had spoken with Ms. Carter at length about this decision, and they had agreed that the story was not about a boy. It was about a system, and that the boy's protection mattered more than the story's emotional accessibility. The piece referred to him only as a 13-year-old student from Southwest Atlanta, nominated through a provision the Foundation's own executive director had worked to suppress. And that restraint, that deliberate withholding of the detail that would have made the story easier to feel, was itself a kind of argument about what the story was actually saying. What the story was actually saying was that the King Horizon Foundation had, over 4 years, redirected $2.3 million away from the communities it publicly claimed to serve, had defunded a grant program that had supported after-school and community development work in Southwest Atlanta, without informing the organizations depending on it, and had selected scholarship recipients in a pattern that correlated more strongly with donor family connections than with the merit criteria the foundation advertised. The audit figures were in the piece. The dates were in the piece. The names of the executive retreats and the consulting firms and the resort in Sea Island were in the piece. Diane had given Marcus Denton's communications office 72 hours to respond, and had included their statement. 4 paragraphs of institutional language that said nothing with considerable thoroughness near the end of the article where statements of that kind belong. By 6 p.m, the piece had been picked up by 2 Atlanta television stations and a regional news aggregator. By midnight, it had been shared widely enough that a national political newsletter included it in their morning briefing. By the following evening, 36 hours after publication, it had reached the kind of circulation that transforms a regional story into a national conversation, the kind of circulation that fills an organization's inbox and changes the tenor of its board meetings and causes corporate communications departments in glass towers to begin drafting careful distancing language about their philanthropic partnerships. The Southwest Atlanta grant was the detail that caught and held. It was specific and concrete in a way that the audit figures, for all their significance, were not, because numbers require interpretation. And a community center director named Roberta Simmons, standing on camera in front of a building with a padlocked gymnasium door, required nothing but attention. Roberta had run the Vine Street Community Center for 14 years, and she stood in front of that padlocked door and described in plain language the night 18 months ago when she had called 50 families to tell them the after-school program was closing, effective the following Friday, not because the need had diminished, not because the program had failed, but because the money had stopped, and no one had told her it was going to stop until it already had. She did not cry on camera. She spoke with the steady, worn clarity of someone who has processed her grief and arrived on the other side of it at something that functions like resolve. The clip ran 43 seconds and was viewed 900,000 times in 2 days. The hashtag trended for 48 hours. The conversation it generated was the kind that social media produces when something true and specific has been introduced into a space usually occupied by things that are true, only in the general sense a mix of anger and recognition, and the particular energy of people who have known something was wrong for a long time, and are experiencing for the first time the sensation of watching that knowledge become public record. 3 of the foundation's corporate donors contacted the board directly to request clarification on these audit findings before making decisions about their next giving cycle. 1 issued a brief public statement indicating they were pausing future commitments pending an independent governance review. The foundation's legal team scheduled 2 emergency calls in 3 days. Marcus Denton agreed to appear on a local news segment Thursday evening, which suggested he had not yet fully understood what had changed. He arrived prepared, his talking points assembled, his affect calibrated to the precise register of a man who is concerned, but not defensive, who takes accountability seriously, but understands that context matters. The interviewer, a woman named Carol Vance, who had covered Atlanta civic affairs for 11 years, and who had read the full audit report twice before the segment, allowed him to deliver his first 2 answers before she placed the documents on the desk between them and asked him specifically about the Sea Island retreat, and the defunded Southwest Atlanta grant, and the 3 scholarship recipients with documented donor family connections. And she asked each question with the unhurried patience of someone who was not going to move on until the question had been genuinely engaged with rather than redirected around. The segment did not go well for Marcus Denton. His answers, which were technically responsive but substantively empty, were clipped from the broadcast and recirculated across platforms, paired in some cases with the original audit figures, in others with Roberta Simmons's 43 seconds in front of the padlocked door. By the following morning, the clips had been viewed collectively more than 12,000 times. 3 board members contacted the foundation's chairman requesting a formal governance review. The foundation's legal team sent Marcus a brief, carefully worded email advising him to step back from public-facing appearances, while the review was ongoing, which was the kind of advice that sounds like counsel and functions like instruction. The moment the neighborhood found out had nothing to do with any of this. It happened because a woman named Gloria, who lived on the third floor of the Brooks building and who cleaned offices downtown and rode the same bus line as Tasha 3 mornings a week, was scrolling through her phone on Friday evening and saw a news photograph taken from the street outside their building, a wide establishing shot that included the building's facade and, visible in the lower left corner of the frame, a clothesline strung between 2 windows on which hung a school uniform, dark navy trousers and a white shirt, the Carver Middle School patch just legible on the breast pocket. Gloria had seen that uniform on the stairs every morning for 2 years. She knocked on Mrs. Patterson's door in 2C first, and Mrs. Patterson called her sister, who lived in 4A, and by Saturday morning, the information had moved through the building and into the 2 buildings adjacent to it, the way information moves in neighborhoods where people have known each other long enough to have established the particular trust that makes news travel faster than any algorithm person to a person door to door in the spaces between what gets written down. By Saturday afternoon, things had begun arriving at the Brooks apartment: a pot of soup from Gloria, a covered casserole dish from an older woman named Miss Eunice, who lived around the corner on Delmar and who Tasha knew only to nod to on the sidewalk, a container of rice and fried chicken from the family in 1B, whose children Elijah had helped with homework twice without being asked. People did not linger. They handed what they had brought to whoever opened the door and said what they had come to say and left, because this was not a neighborhood where people performed their generosity for an audience. They simply brought what they had. Miss Eunice was the one who said it plainly. She stood in the doorway of apartment 4B holding a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil, and she looked at Tasha and said, "Your boy did right." Tasha stood in her own doorway holding a casserole dish she had not cooked, and she felt something move through her that she had not felt in a very long time, something she had not realized she had been holding back until the moment she stopped holding it back. She did not cry easily. She had not cried easily since Elijah's father died, and she had understood in the days immediately following that she could not afford to come apart, that coming apart was a luxury that required someone else to hold things together while you did it, and there was no one else. But she stood in the doorway with the casserole dish and Miss Eunice's eyes on her face, and she cried, not from sadness, not from the particular exhaustion of the past weeks, but from something older and more complicated, the feeling of being seen by the people around you, of being part of something that looked out for itself, of having raised a son who had, in the dark and without an audience, done what you had always hoped he would do when the moment came. Nathaniel called on Sunday morning and asked if Elijah would be willing to say a few words at a press conference the following week, where the foundation would formally announce the scholarship and present the initial findings of the governance restructuring. He was clear that it was not a requirement and not an expectation. He said Elijah had already done something that could not be undone by speaking or not speaking, and that the decision belonged entirely to him. Elijah asked for 24 hours. He talked to his mother that evening at the kitchen table, the 2 of them with mugs of tea, the casserole from Miss Eunice still taking up most of the refrigerator shelf. Tasha told him she would support whatever he decided and meant it completely, and he knew she meant it. He called Jamal, who listened to the explanation with the focused attention he reserved for things that genuinely interested him, and then said, "You gonna be on TV?" And Elijah said probably yes, and Jamal said, "Can I come?" And Elijah said, "I'll ask." And Jamal said, "Tell them I'm your manager." And Elijah laughed for the first time in several days, which was its own kind of medicine. He went to see Ms. Carter on Monday morning before first bell. She was at her desk with her coffee and her gradebook, and she looked at him over her reading glasses when he came in and waited. He told her about the press conference, and she listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You don't owe anyone a performance. Say that plainly to yourself before you decide." And then she said, "But if you speak, speak true, not for the cameras and not for the foundation, and not for anyone who needs you to be a symbol. Speak true for the same reason you do everything else, because it's the right thing and because it's yours to do." Elijah stood in Ms. Carter's classroom doorway in the early morning light, with the school beginning to fill up around them, lockers opening and closing in the hallway, someone's sneakers squeaking on the linoleum, the ordinary sounds of a place that had been for 3 years. One of the few places in his life that consistently treated him as someone worth investing in, and he felt the weight of the decision not as a burden, but as something closer to clarity. The feeling of knowing what you are going to do before you have said it out loud. He said yes. The press conference was held on a Thursday morning in December, and Nathaniel had chosen the location himself over the objection of two board members who felt the optics would be better served by a more prominent venue, by which they meant a more comfortable one, by which they meant a room that did not require any of them to drive into Southwest Atlanta on a weekday morning and stand in a space that still smelled faintly of the decades of community it had housed before the money stopped. The Vine Street Community Center had been cleaned and opened for the first time in 18 months. Roberta Simmons had the heat running by 6 in the morning. Someone had brought folding chairs and arranged them in rows facing a low platform at the front of the main room, and someone else had brought flowers. Two modest arrangements in plastic vases that sat on either side of the podium, and the combination of the folding chairs and the plastic vases and the scuffed linoleum floor and the high windows letting in the flat December light made the room look exactly like what it was. A place that had served real people and intended to do so again, and that was precisely why Nathaniel had chosen it. The media came, 6 cameras, 2 print journalists, Diane Reeves near the back with her notebook open. The board members came, most of them, the 3 who had requested the governance review, seated in the front row, with the careful expressions of people who are aware they are being observed and are trying to inhabit their best selves. Several of the foundation's major donors came, including 2 of the 3 who had paused their commitments, which meant they had not yet decided what they were going to do, and were here to gather the information that would help them decide. The neighbors came, people from the blocks around Vine Street from the Brooks Building, and the buildings adjacent to it from the families who had used the community center when it was open, and who had felt its absence as the particular kind of loss that doesn't make the news, because it accumulates slowly. The quiet subtraction of a place where people had gathered and now couldn't. Tasha Brooks sat in the 4th row in her good coat with Jamal beside her. Jamal had been told twice on the drive over that this was a serious event, and he had agreed both times with the tone of someone who genuinely intended to behave well, and was also 9 years old and operating near the upper limit of his stillness capacity. Ms. Carter sat 2 seats down from Tasha and had her hands folded in her lap and her chin level, and her expression was the one she wore when she was proud of something and was being careful not to show it prematurely. Marcus Denton was not there. He had submitted his resignation 48 hours earlier, a single page delivered by his attorney to the foundation's chairman, the language standard and bloodless citing. A desire to pursue other opportunities and wishing the foundation well in its next chapter. The board had accepted it with the brisk efficiency of people relieved to have a difficult problem resolve itself, and the settlement agreement was being handled by lawyers in a separate process that would take several more weeks. The non-disclosure provision in the agreement was already being scrutinized by outside counsel, retained by 3 board members who had been advised that such provisions in cases involving misallocated charitable funds face significant legal headwinds. That process would take the time it took. It had begun. Nathaniel spoke first. He stood at the podium without notes and without the polished cadence of a man performing leadership. Just a man standing in a room he had built the original version of 22 years ago and was standing in again because he had decided it was time to account for what it had become, and then do the work of making it into something better. He announced the scholarship. He announced the restoration of the Southwest Atlanta Community Grant, funded at twice its original level with disbursement oversight assigned to an independent community advisory committee whose members would be drawn from the neighborhoods the grant served. He announced the establishment of an independent governance board with seats reserved for community representatives from Title I districts, a structural change that would require the foundation's bylaws to be amended at the next board meeting, which he had already scheduled. He said one thing about why he had nominated Elijah Brooks. He said it plainly the way plain things deserve to be said. He said I was cold and he was hungry, and he gave me what he had, and that was all I needed to know about his character. The room was quiet when he stepped back from the podium. Elijah walked to the microphone in his school uniform, the navy slacks and the white shirt, his posture straight in the way his mother had raised him, and his face composed in the way that years of holding himself together in difficult rooms had made habitual. He had no notes. He had thought about writing something down and had decided against it because the things he needed to say were not things he needed to read. They were things he had been carrying long enough to know without prompting. He did not begin by thanking anyone. He began by talking about his neighborhood. He talked about Vine Street and Delmar Avenue and the blocks around Carver Middle School, about the families he had grown up watching, the postal workers and the nursing assistants and the mechanics and the women who cleaned offices downtown and came home on the late bus, the people who worked without stopping and still could not get ahead, not because they lacked intelligence or effort or the willingness to sacrifice, but because the systems built around them had been designed in ways both visible and invisible to keep the distance between where they were and where they were trying to get to just slightly wider than a person could cross in a single lifetime. He talked about what it felt like to move through those systems as a child, to sit in a classroom with cracked textbooks, and understand in the wordless way that children understand things before they have language for them, that the cracked textbooks were not an accident, that someone had made decisions that led to cracked textbooks, and that those decisions had been made by people who did not expect to be held accountable for them, because the people most affected did not have the standing to demand it. He talked about his dream, not in the broad inspirational terms that such occasions tend to invite, but specifically the way he talked about it in his notebook on the fire, escaped the way he talked about it to Nathaniel in the living room and Delmar Avenue. He talked about window placement and zoning and the relationship between a neighborhood's physical design and its residents' sense of dignity. He talked about green space and porches and the difference between a building that houses people and a building that honors them. And then he said the thing he had been turning over in his mind since he decided to say yes, the one sentence that had come to him on Sunday night at the kitchen table and had not changed in the days since. He said, "I don't want to build buildings. I want to build places where my neighbors don't have to apologize for being poor." The room was very quiet, not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for a speaker to finish. The other kind of quiet, the kind that means something true has been said aloud in a room full of people who recognized it, and the recognition required a moment before anyone could decide what to do with it. In the fourth row, Tasha Brooks pressed her hand to her mouth. She had promised herself she was not going to cry again. She had already cried more in the past 2 weeks than in the previous 4 years, combined, and she was a woman who valued her composure and her dignity and the particular kind of strength that comes from not falling apart in public. She pressed her hand to her mouth, and her eyes were bright, and she looked at her son standing at that microphone in his school uniform, and she felt underneath the pride and the relief and the exhaustion of everything the past weeks had required of her, something simpler and more complete. The knowledge that she had done the things she had set out to do when he was born. She had raised a person, a full and decent person, and whatever came next, that was already true and could not be undone. Beside her, Jamal stood up straight. He was not entirely sure why the adults around him were making the faces they were making. He was 9 and the speech had contained several words he intended to look up later. But Elijah was up there at the microphone in front of all these people and the cameras, and that meant something. And Jamal understood instinctively that the correct response to something, meaning something, was to stand up straight. So he did. The audit referral to the Georgia Attorney General's office was filed the following Monday, a formal submission of the audit findings for review under the state's charitable trust statutes, a process that would take months and produce outcomes that were not yet determined, but had been set in motion, which was its own kind of progress. 2 investigative journalists, one in Atlanta and one in Washington, were already several weeks into examinations of similar patterns at other foundations, work that would take more months and more sources and more careful documentation before it became public. But that had begun because a story had broken and created the conditions in which that kind of work could find the attention it needed. 3 corporate donors issued revised philanthropic guidelines tying future charitable commitments to independently verified community impact metrics, the kind of structural change that sounds procedural and means in practice, that the next Marcus Denton in the next foundation will find the architecture slightly less accommodating of the things Marcus Denton had done. The system did not change in a day. It bent, and bending slow and resistant and incomplete as it always is how change begins. After the press conference in a hallway off the main room, where someone had stacked the extra folding chairs, and the noise of the crowd was muffled to a low murmur, Nathaniel found Elijah standing by a window, looking out at the parking lot, where the cameras were still assembled and the neighbors were still talking in small groups in the cold December air. Nathaniel stood beside him for a moment, without speaking the way 2 people can stand together when they have already said the important things and are comfortable in the space that follows. Then he asked Elijah what he was going to do first, now that the scholarship was real, and the path forward had opened up in the way that paths sometimes do, when the right combination of character and circumstance and one person paying attention converges at the right moment. Elijah thought about it. He looked out at the parking lot and thought about it genuinely, the way he thought about things that mattered without rushing to the answer. Then he said, "Study harder. Ms. Carter says, I need to work on my proofs." Nathaniel laughed. It was a real laugh, not the practiced warmth he had deployed in donor meetings and press appearances for 20 years, but the unguarded kind, the kind that arrives before the person has decided to produce it, and it sounded in the empty hallway like something that had been waiting some time for the right occasion. It might have been his first real laugh in months. It felt like it. "Good answer," he said. He extended his hand. Elijah took it. The grip was equal, not the grip of a man bestowing something on a boy, but the grip of two people who had, in their different ways and from their different distances, been working toward the same thing, and who understood each other well enough to mark the moment with the simplest gesture available. Elijah Brooks did not give away his dinner on Vine Street to receive a scholarship. He did not do it to be noticed or remembered or rewarded. He did it because his mother had raised him to be decent, and decency, as she had shown him, by living it every day of his life, does not take a night off just because it is cold and you are hungry and nobody is watching and the world has given you every reasonable excuse to keep walking. Some nights the world watches and does nothing, and some nights one quiet act of goodness travels further than the person who performed it will ever fully know, moving outward from a cold corner on Vine Street, through a file on a researcher's desk, and a folder on a teacher's desk, and a notebook on a fire escape, and a microphone in a community center, until it becomes something larger than one boy's character. Though it started there, it started entirely there. This is one of those true stories, a black story, a life story, that reminds us what real strength looks like when nobody is filming. These are the stories that don't make the front page until they do. But the people who live them never needed the front page. They were building something the whole time. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want to see more stories about real strength, quiet courage, and the people this world underestimates, stay with us because there are more of them, and every one of them deserves to be told.